Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Washoe County Library System's Art Town Mondays with the Nevada Historical Society. My name is Judy, and I'm so glad you're all here. Today's topic is Before Reno and Sparks, Early Communities in the Truckee Meadows, presented by Betsy Morse. A huge shout out to the Nevada Historical Society for converting this in-person event to a live virtual event. We appreciate their commitment to supporting our community with educational events like these. To learn more about the Nevada Historical Society, visit their website at nvhistoricalsociety.org. And now I would like to introduce Linda Burke and Betsy Morse with the Nevada Historical Society. Thank you again, everyone, for being here today.
Hello, everybody. My name is Linda Burke, and thank you, Judy, and thank you to the Washoe County Library System for enabling us to present our history talks this year virtually via Zoom. I am a docent, a volunteer at the Nevada Historical Society, a wonderful institution which I'd like to share some of the many interesting facts about it. I have led school tours there and worked in the bookshop at the Nevada Historical Society. It is Nevada's oldest cultural institution, founded in 1904 by a Professor, Jeannie Weir, at the University of Nevada, Reno. She found that a lot of our historical artifacts were fast disappearing due to the boom and bust cycle of the Nevada economics. And she decided personally to go out and conserve and preserve as much as she could. She went out by horseback, wagon, cart, train sometimes to collect, and she wrote to company directors. That is why we have our 20-horse mule team model in the museum today. She wrote to old timers to reminisce about their past lives on the Comstock. She wrote many letters to people, and so the museum was established, and it is now featured at our on site at the University of Nevada campus. It consists of a wonderful history gallery and a research library with thousands of photographs and manuscripts and newspapers. Because of our coronavirus pandemic, it's not open currently, but from July 15th, it will be open on Wednesdays to the public from 10 to 4, and the research library will be open Thursdays and Fridays by reservation only. Please take note of our website and for the hours of operation. And of course, protocols will be in place, masks and social distancing will be mandatory at that time. And also at the moment, the museum is collecting people's COVID-19 stories and experiences. Submit them via the website or email them or write them to our director, Catherine McGee, at the museum. The address is 1650 North Virginia Street, as I said. Come and visit us, and just as in Jeannie Weir's time we're collecting this information, come and see our two-headed calf, our famous sack of flour that raised $250,000 for the soldiers in their hospitals during the Civil War. And now I would like to introduce our speaker for today. Betsy Morse is also a docent at the Historical Society. She's a retired meteorologist and also volunteers with the American Red Cross and at her church. She works in the library and giving school tours. She loves learning about Nevada and sharing what she has learned with others. And today I'm sure you're going to be very enthralled with what she has to share about the communities that became Reno and Sparks. So, ladies and gentlemen, Betsy Morse and Before Reno.
Thank you, Linda. I chose this topic because I moved to Reno about 12 years ago, and when I did, I asked people about the origin of Reno and Sparks. And what I heard, and you may have heard the same things, is that Reno started as a place called Fuller's Crossing, which was a ferry across the Truckee River, and a little community developed there. Fuller sells out to a man named Lake, so it becomes Lake's Crossing. And then the railroad comes and buys some land from Lake and establishes Reno across the river from where Lake had an inn. So that's the beginning of Reno. And for sparks, well, in the early part of the 20th century, the railroad decides that it wants to move its maintenance yard from Wadsworth to an area just east of Reno and plots out the city of Sparks. Now, those aren't incorrect tellings of history, but what they miss is the fact that before there was Reno and decades before there was a Sparks, there were some communities, some thriving communities in the Truckee Meadows that we almost never talk about today. So I wanted to explore some of those. The pictures that I'm using, except for two that I took myself, are pictures from the nearly 750,000 photos that we have at the Nevada Historical Society. And so please, these are, it's a wonderful resource for our community that you may want to delve into. The other thing about the pictures is, while the period we're talking about is the dawn of the age of photography, basically my history today stops in 1868, and there are no pictures of the Truckee Meadows before 1868. So the pictures are appropriate for the areas that I'm talking about, but they are not from the time frame that I'll be discussing. So what are we talking about when we mention the Truckee Meadows? Well, it depends on what time frame you're discussing. The first people to refer to the Truckee Meadows would have been some of the early pioneers who are traveling west on the California Trail, which initially goes right through the Truckee Meadows. And so these people are coming through the Truckee River Canyon. And this is after they have spent months on the trail and weeks going across hot, dusty, dry Nevada with very little feed for their animals and very little decent water to drink. And they suddenly come out of the Truckee River Canyon and they are in an area with mile after mile of meadows. And so the Truckee Meadows becomes a haven for these people as they rest up before they do the final climb up into the mountains and over into California. And of course, these early pioneers are largely farm families. So they come in, out of the Truckee River Canyon, and the meadow spreads to their left, miles of meadow along Steamboat Creek. And very quickly, the early pioneers discovered that there's more meadow. There's an additional meadow in an area that they call the Steamboat Valley, which is also along Steamboat Creek. And there are two more meadow areas, again, along Steamboat Creek that are south of this main valley. So we have the Truckee Meadows. Now, the rest of the area, the flat area that they've joined, is pretty much considered uninhabitable. Unless you're along Steamboat Creek or along the Truckee River, the area basically has no water and nothing grows there. But there is this marvelous meadow area that is really entrancing to people as a rest area. Now, what exactly is the Truckee Meadows? Well, today we think of it as being the entire Reno Sparks area. It's sort of a nickname for it. This is after initially it is just a specific meadow. But in 1880, and this is the definition we're going to use, the Truckee Meadow was basically anything that was between Lemons Valley to the north, today we call it Lemon Valley, and Washoe Valley to the south. So some areas that had nothing to do with meadow and aren't even part of this broader valley get lumped into what the Truckee Meadows is. So it includes Pleasant Valley to the south. It goes off to the west and up into the mountains, into Verdi and Crystal Peak, and it would include the Peavine mining area on the mountain, Peavine Mountain. So that's all part of the Truckee Meadows as we're going to be looking at it today. The first people who live in the Truckee Meadows, or at least the first that we know of, would have been the members of the Washoe tribe. And when the first fur trappers arrive in the Truckee Meadows in about 1830, they report that there are probably 300 members of the tribe who are overwintering in the Truckee Meadows. And they're living in small family groups of 15 to 20 people with little encampments just spread all over the Truckee Meadows. Then the next group that comes to the area are, of course, the immigrants, and they're coming over the California Trail. So the California Trail is in blue on this map, and the official California Trail is established in 1844, and its first branch is the Truckee River Trail, which is in black, and it goes right through the Truckee Meadows. It's a pretty rough trail, but it is the first wagon route over the Sierra. And for the first 4 years, 1844 through 1848, we have a few hundred people coming over the California Trail every year, going to California to make their living mostly as ranchers and farmers. And over time, 2 more branches of the California Trail are developed. The first one, and the best route, is the one that goes over Carson Pass. And this one does not go through the Truckee Meadows. And so it siphons a lot of traffic off of the Truckee River route. The other trail that develops, and this is a terrible trail, is the Applegate-Lassen Trail. It should never have been created. It's really a death trap. But by the time you reach the California Gold Rush in 1849, where you go from having hundreds of people crossing over the California Trail to having tens of thousands of people crossing over the trail every summer and early fall. These are the ways that they are going, these 3 trails. It very quickly becomes clear that these trails are inadequate. They can't handle the traffic. People have to be rescued from the trail. Hundreds of people wind up getting rescued from these trails as winter sets in. There's no forage for the animals. So in 1850, a new trail is developed, and this is called the Hennis Pass Road. And this is a toll road. It's meant for freight wagons, and it is better than any of the other 3 main trails that exist. But there is a charge for it. So in 1851, yet another trail is developed, and this is the Beckworth Pass route. And it turns out this is the lowest pass and the easiest route of them all, but it is a little bit longer than some of the other trails over the Sierra. But both the Hennis Pass route and the Beckworth Trail again bring traffic into the Truckee Meadows because they both take off from the California Trail in the Truckee Meadows. So by 1851, most of the traffic, again, that's going to California is being funneled through the Truckee Meadows. And then eventually there is another route that's developed, and this is the Central Overland Route. Basically, this follows today's Highway 50, and it's used mostly by people who in 1859 and thereafter are going to Virginia City where they think they're going to become rich. Now, even though we have people who are passing through the Truckee Meadows from 1844 on, there are no permanent Euro-American settlements in the Truckee Meadows for quite a while. In 1852, the Truckee Meadows gets its first trading post, and this is a place called Jameson's, and it is just west of where you come out of the Truckee River Canyon and enter into the Truckee Meadows. But it's a seasonal trading post. It's there in the summer and the fall, but the traders had no real interest in dealing with the Washoe who were overwintering there. And so they were only there during the time when the pioneers would be coming through, the Euro-Americans would be coming through. In 1853, there's another trading post, and in 1854, there are now 2 seasonal trading posts. One of them is a little bit to the west of Jameson's, near where Glendale is today. And we'll talk more about Glendale in a moment. And the other one is just as you start heading into the Sierra at a place called Crystal Peak. And we'll talk about that as well. So this is 1854. We now have 2 trading posts that are in what's called considered the Truckee Meadows. And in 1854, what we have coming in are land speculators. Now, according to the US government, the area that's the Truckee Meadows belongs to the Washoe tribe. But that doesn't matter to the land speculators who are only there in the summer, in the early fall, to protect the land that they are basically squatting on. But within a very quick period of time, all of the arable land in the Truckee Meadows has someone who claims that it is his, and that person is not a member of the Washoe tribe. It isn't until 1856 that any Euro-Americans overwinter in the Truckee Meadows, that they're there to stay. And this first group that comes would be a group of members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In 1855, Orson Hyde, who is an important member of the church, is sent by Brigham Young to Nevada to establish a new place for the Mormons to live, and he develops Franktown down in Washoe Valley. The following year, in 1856, Brigham Young again sends Orson Hyde out here, and he wants to develop another location for Mormon settlers. And so Orson Hyde is looking at 2 locations. One of them is the Truckee Meadows, and the other one is Honey Lake, which is up near Susanville. After he looks at them, he decides that the best place to come would be the Truckee Meadows, because it does have this wonderful area that has lots of water and things grow so well there. His problem is that every bit of farmable land in the Truckee Meadows already has been grabbed up by a land speculator. So what he does is he lets it be known that he has several hundred people who are following him, will soon be coming, and he is going to lead them to Honey Lake. When the land speculators hear this, almost every one of them rushes out of the Truckee Meadows and out of Washoe Valley, and they run up to Honey Lake so that they can stake claims up there and then sell their land to these families that are coming. As soon as the land speculators have left, Orson Hyde brings his flock in, and they establish communities in the Truckee Meadows. And the main one that they establish is in Pleasant Valley. So that we have several hundred members of the church who are settled, some of them in the northern part of Washoe Valley, and then the rest of them in the southern part of the Truckee Meadows. And they very quickly establish ranches, and life seems good for a year. But in 1857, Brigham Young is having a fairly serious spat with the US government, and there is some fear that there may be a war. And so Brigham Young calls all of the Mormons back to Salt Lake City. So the people who are living in Pleasant Valley have to quickly sell their homes, or in some cases just abandon them and go back to Salt Lake. But in the year that they've been there, Pleasant Valley gets a new name. Because so many of the families that are living there are polygamous families, the valley becomes known not as Pleasant Valley, but as Plurality Valley. Now, after the faithful leave, there are more people who come into Pleasant Valley. By 1862, there are several dozen people who are living in Pleasant Valley. There's a stamp mill there to crush ore. And they have found exactly what Orson Hyde found. This is a good place to live. The next community that's developed in the Truckee Meadows is a place called Stone and Gates Crossing. And this is initially a ferry across the Truckee River that's associated with both a trading post and an inn. And it's founded by John Stone and Charles Gates. So we are now in 1857, the year that the LDS leave. The area is also the year that Stone and Gates develop their crossing over the Truckee. And quite a few families come to live here. The actual community is on the north side of the Truckee, and you can find it today if you take South McCarran across the Truckee River. So it's on the east side of the valley. It's called Stone and Gates Crossing for quite a few years, but the name is too long. It won't fit on a post stamp, and it's just a lot of words to say. And so eventually the people in Stone and Gates Crossing decide to change the name of their community, and they settle on using the name of a local hotel, the Glendale. And Glendale, after just a few weeks, instead of being two words, becomes one word. Now, Mr. Stone, John Stone of Stone and Gates Crossing, has a place in history that's beyond just developing this community. Turns out that Stone knew a little bit about minerals. And so in 1859, when word comes that up in Virginia City, some gold has been found, but that the miners are having trouble with this grayish muck that is wrecking their gold panning experience, he starts thinking maybe it's not just muck. He goes up to Virginia City, gathers up some samples of what's up there, takes them over the Sierra to Sacramento to have these things assayed, and comes back with the news that yes, there is gold up at Virginia City, but that the real wealth up there is silver, and this muck that is ruining the equipment is actually a fortune in silver. Oddly, even though he's the one who recognizes that there is silver and lots of silver in Virginia City, he remains at Stone and Gates Crossing and lives there the rest of his life and does not try to take advantage of the riches that are up there. He finds enough riches in having a trading post and an inn along the Truckee. Now, Stone and Gates Crossing grows pretty quickly, and in 1858, a year after the crossing is put in place, quite a few ranchers start arriving. They have heard about the good land that is in the Truckee Meadows. And so we have ranchers who are settling near Stone and Gates Crossing, soon to become Glendale. Over time, Stone and Gates hear that another crossing over the river, and this would be Fuller's Crossing, is going to change from having a ferry across the river to actually building a bridge. And so Stone and Gates decide they need to build a bridge too. So in 1860, we get two bridges across the Truckee. Glendale quickly becomes the queen city of the Truckee Meadows. It's said that Stone and Gates ruled unchallenged in the Meadows before 1868. And one of the early pioneers, George Peckham, said, Glendale was the literary and social metropolis of the Truckee Meadows and Steamboat Valley. It said that this was a place where the ranchers would gather and have a good old time. Everything changes for Glendale in 1868, which is when the railroad plots out Reno and starts selling land for the city of Reno. By the end of 1868, every business in Glendale has moved to Reno. And Glendale starts a very quick decline. It no longer is a real community, although it still exists as an area with successful ranches. But it no longer is the Queen City of the Truckee Meadows. Now, the reason that Glendale rose to importance was mostly location. If you are on the California Trail, especially after 1850, you get to Glendale, and from Glendale, you can either head on to the Hennis Pass Toll Road or north to the Beckworth Trail. But Glendale is the crossroads for both of these important trails. So it's a natural stopping place. Plus, it does have great farmland. Now, if Glendale is the logical crossroads and place to develop for traffic going east-west, what about traffic that's going north-south? Well, from the earliest times, the Washoe were spread all along the east side of the Sierra, so they already had trails that would connect the Truckee Meadows down to what today is Carson City. When Carson City becomes first the territorial capital and then later the state capital, of course, this trail becomes more formalized and would lead you from the Truckee Meadows down to Carson. In 1859, with the advent of Virginia City, you're going to have a lot of traffic going into Virginia City, and eventually you have the creation of the Virginia Road, which is part of this trail down to Carson City, but then it veers off and goes to Virginia City. And of course, Virginia Road becomes Reno's Virginia Street. And near the same place where these two roads diverge, you have another way to go. You can go to the west and up to Lake Tahoe or into the logging camps that are feeding the mines that are in Virginia City. So you have this divergence of roads, and again, this is would be a good place to have a successful community, and indeed there is one there. And it's called Huffacres. Huffacres is formed by two men. It's settled by Granville Huffacre and Lou Drexler. They're storekeepers in Salt Lake City. And in 1858, a year after the Mormon faithful have gone back to Salt Lake, these two men from Salt Lake City drive 500 head of cattle from Salt Lake into the Truckee Meadows. And they settle just south of what today we call the Huffacre Hills. And they raised, they cut grass for cattle that would be coming with some of the pioneers, immigrants coming across this area. And they were known to have the sweetest water in the West, very good water that came from the Truckee Meadows. And because they were storekeepers, they built a store and an inn in this place that's called Huffacres, and it quickly booms. In 1860, with the rush to Washoe to gain, where everyone thought they would become rich in Virginia City, Huffacres gets a Pony Express office. It becomes the primary stage stop in the Truckee Meadows, gets a post office, hotels, saloons, express yards, and livery stations. It was known as, and this is a quote, the gathering place for bachelor ranchers to come and give rein to their jolly natures. And it featured dances and horse races and apparently very loud arguments about politics. Huffacres is also the site of the first school in the Truckee Meadows, and that school building still exists. It's been moved to Bartley Ranch Park. And it's the site of the first cemetery in the Truckee Meadows. Ty Cobb wrote, almost immediately, Huffaker's ranch became a center of activity. Reno was just a sparse settlement with a few shacks. There weren't very many ranches between Huffaker's and the area that will become the original Reno. And this is simply because there is no water in those areas. It won't be until the ditches are created beginning in 1864 that much of what is the Truckee Meadows is actually able to be farmed. But the area right along the true meadows is a very rich area. And we do have some alfalfa that they start to grow in the Truckee Meadows in 1864, and this turns out to be one of the biggest crops that we have in the Truckee Meadows for a while. Another community that develops is at Eastman Mill. George Eastman builds a mill on the just off the Truckee River, and it's close to where the Grand Sierra is today. It's a wide spot in the river, and he is able to bring logs down the river from the logging camps that are higher up in the Sierra. They're floated down the river and then are captured in this wide spot where they're kept until they can be milled. Now, the mill can only run a few months out of the year because most of the year the Truckee River doesn't run high enough to float the logs down. So the logs are floated down in the spring when the water's high or after heavy rains in the summer. But around the mill, you have the people who are working in the mill, and they live there. There is a lane that is established that runs from the mill into what eventually becomes Reno. And that lane still exists today, and it's called Mill Street, after the Eastman Mill. There's another mill that's developed, and this one is developed about a mile north of the area that will become the original Reno. And it's erected by an English company, and it's not a logging mill. This is a stamp mill to stamp quartz. And it has a 20 stamp mill. And there's a cluster of homes around the mill for the mill workers, and it becomes the town of Auburn, which booms for a while. However, with the birth of Reno very quickly expands north and completely absorbs the city of Auburn, or the village of Auburn. Another place that develops, like many places, it has more than one name. It's a crossing over the Truckee. It's the westernmost crossing that's in the actual valley that the Truckee Meadows is in. And it starts as Stout's Crossing. And George Stout builds a log bridge over the Truckee in 1859. And today, it's where Mayberry crosses the Truckee River. The following year, across the river from where Stout has established himself, a man named Hunter puts up some things. And the area goes from being called Stout's Crossing to being called Hunter's Crossing. And eventually Hunter sells out to Mayberry, and that name sticks till today. Farther up the river, as you're starting to climb into the mountains, we have yet another crossing over the river, and this is O'Neill's Crossing. And this is a bridge that was built in 1860, and it's close to where Bridge Street is in Verdi today. And O'Neill's Crossing has a small community that's with it. So that's in 1860. But before there had been O'Neill's Crossing, there had been a trading post that had been established at Crystal Peak, and that is still operating. So in 1854, you have the trading post in Crystal Peak, which is 2 miles away from O'Neill's Crossing. In 1864, 10 years after the trading post, the Crystal Peak Company, which is a mining and logging company, develops a town. It creates Crystal Peak for its workers. And it very quickly grows into a town of about 300 people. And mostly the mining isn't that great, but it's a wonderful area for sawmills. And so they have quite a few sawmills there, and these feed the mines that are in Virginia City. Now, in 1868, we have the railroad trying to decide where it is going to put its east side of the Sierra Center. And they are looking at 3 places. One of them is Crystal Peak, which by this time has about 300 people. When word gets out that Crystal Peak might become the center, people rush to Crystal Peak. And so in the beginning of 1868, you suddenly have 1,500 people at Crystal Peak. It is the largest community in the Truckee Meadows. Another place that's being considered as a site for this center for the railroad is Glendale. Unfortunately for Glendale, because it is in a marshy area, when the railroad people visit in the spring to make their final decision, Glendale is flooding. So it kind of puts itself out of the running. And the third place they're considering is a place that really has nothing much in it. It's between Lakes Crossing and Auburn. It's an empty area of land that is owned by Mr. Lake. And of course, eventually they decide on this plot of land that Lake has, and they plot out the city of Reno. Well, as soon as Reno, the soon to develop Reno, is named as what will be the center for the railroad, Crystal Peak quickly loses almost all of the people who had rushed there thinking they were going to become rich because it would become the railroad center. So we have Crystal Peak going into rapid decline. And of course, today it's really just considered part of Verdi. Another one of our boom and bust towns is Galena. Galena is interesting. It starts as a mining town, and the site is actually discovered by several Paiute Indians. And so in 1860 is when they discover that there are some mineable resources there, and it becomes the first mining site in the Truckee Meadows. The mining doesn't really produce a lot, but what quickly becomes apparent is that there's money to be made from the virgin timber that's in the area. So Galena actually picks itself up and moves half a mile to be in an easier location to move boards out of the area and get them onto the route to Virginia City. And Galena grows rapidly, and at one point is the largest community in the Truckee Meadows. By 1863, it has 11 sawmills, and it's said that the town streets during the height of commercial activity were crowded with grog shops, overflowed with charcoal burners, wood choppers, timbermen, millers, miners, bullwhackers, and teamsters. By 1864, there were 250 people who lived in Galena. There was a disastrous fire in 1865, the town rebuilt. In 1867, there was another terrible fire. This time, Galena was not rebuilt. By this time, by 1867, there were mills along the Carson River. It was easier to get the lumber from the Carson mills up to Virginia City than it was to get the lumber from the Galena mills. So Galena just goes into a very rapid decline. And today, there is nothing left of Galena. But the site itself, the second site for Galena, is near where Callahan Ranch is today. Then we have Peavine, Po City, Poeville, Poedunk, the place that had almost as many names as it had people at certain periods in its history. Peavine is another mining community, and it's on Peavine Mountain. In 1863, the town of Peavine was laid out. It's 9 miles from what is then Reno. It has copper, silver, and gold. The problem is that mining hasn't advanced enough to really be able to process the ore that's here. And so Peavine flames up and pretty quickly declines. But in 1865, 2 years later, additional riches are found in Peavine. And in those 2 years, mining technology has advanced quite a bit. There are new types of furnaces that can actually make use of the minerals that are on Peavine Mountain. So we now have Po City, which eventually becomes known as Poeville, the name that it still has today, although there's no town there. It gets a 10-stamp mill and one of these new furnaces that can actually process the ore that's there, and has 150 people in 1865. Then there's a mining decline at the end of the 1860s, and Peavine, Po City, Poeville, Poedunk rapidly declines. There's another mining boom in the 1870s, and the miners come back and start mining again here, but then there's another mining bust at the end of the 1870s, and that really is the end of the organized large development on Peavine, although there still is mining on Peavine today. So what about these communities? There was a census in 1860, and at that time, the communities in the Truckee Meadows are so small, and they're all unincorporated, that all they did was count dwellings and people. So there's 22 dwellings and just over 100 people living in the Truckee Meadows. However, this is not a true account because the census only counts Euro-Americans. So it didn't count the Native Americans or the Mexicans who were in the area. So take this and multiply by about 3, and you might get a true count of the number of people who were living there. Then another census is taken in 1862. And the area in just 2 years has really swelled. And again, we're not counting Native Americans or Mexicans. These are just Euro-Americans who are being counted. But instead of having just over 100 people, we now have more than 400 people, and they are identified by areas. So at this time, Galena, the mining camp turned lumber camp, is the largest community in the Truckee Meadows with over 200 people. A distant second is Huff Acres. Following that is Glendale. And then O'Neill's Crossing. Fuller's Crossing that becomes Lakes Crossing, that becomes Reno, is definitely the puny place in the Truckee Meadows in 1862. And here's a comparison of 3 censuses, including the 1870 census. And you can really see here the boom and bust cycle that is so common all across Nevada, where hundreds of places develop seemingly out of nothing, boom up rapidly, and then almost as quickly die away, and only a few manage to have staying power. So we have Galena, the mining town lumber camp, which in 1862 is the big boy on the block. But of course, after the devastating fire in 1867, the people move away. By 1870, there are only 55 people there, and within another decade, there will be far fewer than that. Huff Acres has greatly expanded between 1862 and 1870, and it will remain an independent community, a strong independent community for several more decades. Well into the early part of the 20th century, Huff Acres is still a separate, although unincorporated community, but eventually it does become swallowed up by the ever-expanding Reno. Glendale, between 1862 and 1870, reached its peak of about 250 people, but you can see that between 1868 and 1870, after the businesses go, Glendale loses half its people between 1868 and 1870. O'Neill's Crossing in the Verdi area sort of stay stable, even though the railroad does build a town at Verdi, and it eventually will blossom, but not in 1870. Peavine, of course, is another one of these places where the census numbers are misleading because there's 14 people there in 1862, 10 in 1870, and so you really can't tell that there were 150 people there in the in-between years. Fuller's Crossing, that becomes Reno, of course, has gone from 8 to becoming the place where more than half of the people in the Truckee Meadows now live, over 1,000 people in just 2 years. From 1868 to 1870, 1,000 people have moved into the new community of Reno. Auburn Mill didn't exist in 1862. It's a successful little community in 1870, but just a few years later will be overwhelmed by Reno. And of course, Crystal Peak is the real boom and bust story. No one there in 1862, only 120 people there in 1870, but in 1868, there had been 1,500 people there. So the typical boom and bust cycle that continues today in Nevada. So thank you for attending. And Linda, I believe I turn it over to you now.
Okay, Betsy, I have some questions here for you. Were some of the 1830 fur trappers of the Hudson Bay Company?
Most of the fur trappers who would have come into Nevada, into this part of Nevada, came from the American Company, but the Hudson Bay Company definitely came south into northern Nevada. So, you know, there was some mingling in the area.
Okay, that question was from Dale. So thank you, Dale. I hope that answers your question. Another one from Mariette. What are the men doing with the tent in the Peavine photo? If you can remember back to that one.
Initially in most of the mining camps, they're built so quickly that people did live in tents for a while until they could build permanent dwellings. Although some of the communities don't last long enough for very many permanent dwellings to exist.
Okay. Also, I have a question, Betsy. Is the Crystal Peak mining camp there the park that we have in Verdi today that you can visit?
Right, that's where the town of Crystal Peak was.
Okay, so that's a very neat place to visit today that you can go and learn more about that particular site. Also, are there any remnants of the other towns that you know of Auburn or Poeville?
Well, Auburn, I don't know if there's, because of its location, I suspect that anything that was there has now been rebuilt as something else because it was just completely absorbed into Reno. Poeville, there is nothing left. And if there had been anything left, it would have been destroyed in the fire from last weekend. But it really has not, I don't even think there were foundations, 50 years ago. It just was gone. But some of the others, in Glendale, there still are ranches in that area, some of which may not date back to 1868, but certainly date back to the 1880s. When you get down to Huffacres, if you go up to the Huffacre Park and look down, there are some old buildings there, and I don't know when they date from, but I'd like to think that they come from the time when Huffacres was still an independent community.
Judith Simon says to anybody, are there structures today in any of these settlements? Some of them, I think you can go to one of the sites just off Whittakin Road. There is a part of the ditch, one of the early ditches there that is part of remnants of Auburn itself, I think. But I'm not too sure about that. You'd have to check it. And there are a few mines which they don't want you to go near too.
Right.
So we really can't talk about those too much. I think there was a hand raised by somebody, but I think you have to write in your question. Somebody wants to know, where does the name Reno originate? Well, I can tell you the answer to that, but you should really come back to our early Reno sessions in a couple of weeks. We will tell you about that. It's actually from a Civil War general, General Reno, and one of the early directors of the railroad, Mr. Crockett, came through, and suppose it was a friend. Reno was a Civil War general. He wanted his friend remembered, but also it was a nice short name that looked good on the tickets. So they used that in preference to some of the other names that were promulgated. But if you want to find out more about the origin of Reno, then you come to our early Reno series in a couple of weeks. Carol Coleman says there was a school on Callahan Road until the 1950s. Was Galena there, and do you know if anything remains of that?
If anything remains of Galena, not of the original community. It's gone.
Well, I think that may be all of our questions. I want to thank everyone for attending, and remember to send your COVID stories to the Nevada Historical Society and check the website for our opening details. And thank you again to the library for hosting this session, and we'll be back again this afternoon at 1 p.m. for a session on gaming.
Hey everyone, this is Judy again with Washoe County Library System, and I want to personally thank all of you for joining us today. We are so happy that we were able to bring this to you, virtually, and look for more great events on our website.